The Fact Check podcast is hosted by 3 rehab professionals with decades of combined experience. But I'm not one of them. I'm just making this intro. If you are finding the world of health and musculoskeletal care confusing and contradicting, and let's be honest, at times a bit crazy, our efforts here are aimed against all that misinformation through real research and real evidence. Let's do this, people. Nothing you hear on this podcast should be considered medical advice.
So, I do want to touch on RFK again, because again, one way he weasels out of this, he uses what I call a motte. Well, I don't call it. It's what it's called. It's a motte and Bailey fallacy. Are you familiar with it?
Describe
so I'll
it.
explain it. I'll show the you'll understand when I play it. So, I think it's this one.
You've said previously that no vaccine is safe or effective, which is...
I've never said that.
You did say that in a podcast interview in July.
Never said that.
You did say
this
that.
one.
What I meant, which was a bad use of...
So this is after he was like, they played his audio. He said, I never said that. And then they played the audio and she was like, you did say that. That's what he explains after.
What I meant, which was a bad use of words, and as none of the vaccines that are currently on the mandated schedule for children, the 72 vaccines,
72
have ever been tested in a pre-licensing safety study. What that means is that we do not know. We do not know what the risk profile is for those products, and you cannot prove or say with any scientific certainty that any of those products are causing.
So you're saying you still believe that no vaccines are safe and effective?
Oh, what I'm saying is that none of the 72 vaccines has ever been tested in a safety study.
Okay.
There's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah, so if I explain just the motte and Bailey, essentially the motte and Bailey, I'm going to pull an image here. So, hang on. It's the name of the fallacy where essentially you advocate a very, very controversial position or a hard-to-defend position, and that would be like essentially the Bailey. Like the Vikings can attack you here, right? So you say like vaccines don't exist, and then when the Vikings come, like let's say the CNN journalist, you retreat to the motte, which is above this one, and it's very solid and easy to defend. So you'll say like, no, I just want more investigation into vaccines. So that's the motte and Bailey. So he does that all the time. It's it's like the new type of, like charlatans do that a lot. People that hate women do the same. They're like, women like should like bow down to their husbands and like they shouldn't go outside or whatever. And then they're like, well, I'm just an advocate for like traditional lifestyle.
Right.
People can do what they want. It's like, that's not what you said.
Yeah.
It's very annoying because it drags in moderates, like people that I know that are just moderate. And they're just like, well, he just wants to ask questions. It's like, that's not his intention. And his actions have said the opposite all his life.
And it's also like, it's a red herring, right? Because you're like now distracting from the actual topic at hand by suggesting, that it's actually this story. But first of all, there isn't 72 vaccines. He's just lying his ass off like he has for decades. There are about 13 vaccines that are recommended, and if you added up every single dose, because some are multi-dose to give optimal protection through the age of 18, a person would receive between 30 and 50 doses of vaccine up through the age of 18, and that includes an annual flu shot. So no kid is getting 72 vaccines, but even if they were, there would be a reason behind it, because all of those vaccines are studied for safety and for efficacy and also for optimal numbers of doses. And we have many multi-dose vaccines. So, he's lying. These things have been extensively studied. Not only do we have pre-market studies, because none of these are approved without phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 clinical trials, but we also do phase 4 post-market surveillance. So we look at the safety profile after vaccines have been rolled out in large cohorts, and it allows us to say, well, were there any really, 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 really rare events that we're seeing now that our vaccinated population has exceeded the sample size of the clinical trial? So, these things are just not true.
Yeah. And just to show how rigorous the process is, like this is from the American Society of Biochemistry,
Yeah.
their biology, and this fits with other data I've seen. It can go higher depending on the case.
I was gonna say it's
higher.
It's more than 90% because
for cancer it's 97, I think.
Yeah,
or 99. Yeah,
because cancers are really complicated and they involve the immune system and a lot of unique factors. But yeah, no, we're not just these things are not rolled out or approved willy nilly. There's an incredible amount of scrutiny, and the irony that he's saying that when he and his friends profit over a completely untested wellness industry, when he wants people to take unregulated chelating agents and stem cell therapies that have no data, not even safety data to support them, is just absurd.
Yeah, and for people that are listening at the audio only version, I'm looking at a paper that says, an article that says 90% of clinical drug development fails. Like, it doesn't even reach human trials. So
yeah, because
there is a great level of oversight before it becomes marketed. Yeah,
and because you have to do all these petri dish studies and you have to do toxicology studies in cell culture, and you're looking at how they're metabolized by liver cells. We do a lot of there's a whole field of study called pharmacokinetics and metabolism, where we use hepatocytes, liver cells, in petri dishes to see the dosage at which a compound or a treatment might harm them. And that's all done way before you even get close to talking about clinical testing.
Yeah, and you mentioned 13 vaccines. I have the Cleveland Clinic pulled here. You're correct. There's close to 13. So it's about 15 different immunizations for children. So not even close to 72.
But,
so,
his Children's Health Defense website has pictures of kids with needles sticking out all over their arms. And that is what he uses to scare parents from protecting their kids from debilitating diseases.
Yeah, so I have a little query for you. This is purely gossip. So apparently his kids are all vaccinated. Do you think it's A, because he's a lying grifter he just cares about scaring people for money? Or B, it's just because he cheated on his wife so much that she was like, my kids are getting vaccinated, otherwise we're done and your political career is dead. Which one do you think it is?
Gosh, I mean, it could be either. They're both plausible.
Or both.
I think it's probably one. I think it's he's a lying grifter, because he made in 2021 alone, he made $16 million spreading COVID anti-vaccine conspiracy theories. Yeah, I've done a lot of digging on RFK. He's
That's
probably
crazy.
Single-handedly have caused the most harm to science and health of any single person in the last 40 years. So
yeah, he's in the 30 dozen misinformation list. I think they're responsible for
he's
a vast swath of the misinformation.
Yep, he's the disinformation dozen, along with all the other vaccine grifters. He's also considered a pandemic profiteer because he's made millions and millions and millions of dollars, both spreading misinformation and selling products that don't have evidence to support them, like ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine. But even before he moved into the anti-vaccine stuff, he started with the fake environmentalism so that he could make money off of lawsuits against conventional farming and modern agriculture, like genetic engineered foods. And he's obviously still continuing that. And, that's also eroded our food stability, our food supply, the ability to grow crops that can survive more hostile climates, that can be grown without pesticides, that can produce foods with more nutrients. And he was one of the very first lawyers to make the false claims about glyphosate and cancer, and made millions of dollars off of tort lawsuits, which is a very common tactic among tort lawyers. To basically create these lawsuits, and then you have this emotional appeal in a civil court to a jury, and that doesn't require scientific evidence to rule in your favor.
Yeah, I agree. It's completely different. I just want to close this chapter on vaccines. So we've already shown that vaccines are effective. I showed the pictures. So I think he said there's no safe and effective vaccine. So even if we say he meant, it has to be both together. In terms of safety, there's this Those are vaccines for kids. Some of it, like most of them, he's been against. Well, all of them he's been against. So Gill, meta-analysis from 2021, safety of vaccines used for routine immunization in the United States, an updated systematic review and meta-analysis. So across a large body of research, we found few associations of vaccines and serious key adverse events. However, rare events are challenging to study. Any adverse events should be weighted against the protective benefits that vaccines provide. So essentially, they compared with other vaccines that have already been shown to be safe, and the new ones are just as safe.
Yeah.
Or more safe. So
yeah, and
there's no argument to be made.
This is the whole like logic when we talk about, everything has a risk, but these people, are looking at vaccination where your likelihood of an adverse event, a true adverse event like a allergic reaction or things like that, we're talking rates of 1 in hundreds of thousands of doses or 1 in millions of doses. These likelihood of getting struck by a vehicle walking across the street or even getting hit by lightning are orders of magnitude higher than this.
Yeah, no, 100%. Yeah, and even for COVID, it's quite low. So a lot of people will quote this. We'll talk about it later, but the idea that vaccines and COVID, there's I think there's 10% of adverse events, but the adverse event can be as small as my arm hurts.
Yeah.
Okay, just don't be no offense, but don't be a pussy. No, it's not about women. It's just be an adult. Yeah, it's better than dying or getting on a respirator, in my opinion. So yeah. Did you know there's a debate as to whether pussy is referring to women or pusillanimous? So I choose the latter because I love the word, but I know it's offensive. So yeah, I'm trying to kind of wean it out of my language. So I'm sure in 20 years they're gonna be, wow, grandpa, you're so, I can't believe you said that. So I guess hi, kids. Anyways, so we're gonna go into details about the other stuff, the fluoride, the data on that. I'm gonna play devil's advocate, but first of all, I think we should caveat by saying stuff we agree with on it, and you can add. I think for me, the one thing he said that I think was good. He wants to subsidize fruits and veggies, and he wants to tax junk food. Wonderful. I agree. I've been saying that for a long time. Is there anything else you agree with on him regarding? I'm not saying you want him in power, just stuff that you would agree, there's no overlap in your beliefs.
I mean, if he's gonna subsidize fruits and vegetables, that has to include conventionally grown fruits and vegetables, and I don't know if that is gonna fall under that purview because he's, again, made a lot of money demonizing conventional and modern agriculture and promoting organic, which is not beneficial even for the planet, and he opposes genetic tools for agriculture and medicine. So yeah, I don't.
Yeah, it's pretty ironic to be against GMO, weather resistance and bug resistance.
Yeah, I know.
And also being against pesticide. It's just pick one.
Yeah, I know.
A lot of people don't understand that you can put, the example I have. I don't know if they still use BT corn. It used to be 90% of the crops in North America, I think. And it's just you can put less pesticide or herbicide because it's in the crop.
Yeah, because it resists it naturally, and so you don't need to add extra things. And people are well, why do you use pesticides to begin with? It's well, because otherwise you wouldn't have food. And it's not and they're well, I grow things pesticide free, and it's it's not your backyard garden. We're feeding 8.1 billion people on the planet. They're using pesticides to prevent, to ensure that the food they're growing for you is not lost to things that are trying to destroy it.
Yeah, and people have to understand. I think people forgot that too. That's probably privileged. It used to be a huge concern. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think it was in the 80s. Norman Borlaug, apparently, we were reaching what's called carrying capacity. So the Earth didn't have the capacity to support human life anymore because we didn't have enough food or the ability to transport the food to people before they died of starvation. So we came up with, I think it was 6 or 8 crops. He was these are really good staples. We're going to plant them all over. And these are really good at surviving the weather, staying shelf life, all of that. And he increased the carrying capacity, I think, to, 10 million now, just by doing that. So he won a Nobel Peace Prize. He's probably the person that saved the most people ever. He's a reverse Genghis Khan. And it's just that's one of the reasons why we have GMOs. It's just because otherwise people would be dead. Maybe not you because you're
Right.
you know, you're a white privileged lady in California or a little random guy in Illinois that has like enough money to be anti-vaxxer, and you're not like a little kid in India dying
Yeah.
and starving, you know?
Yep.
Yeah, I'm painting stereotypes just to, you know, paint a picture. Obviously, there's ignorant people all over, but, you know, you get it. All right, so, yeah, not a lot we agree on. Do you agree on the idea that we need more oversight of Big Pharma? Because that's the big one people rally against for.
I mean, I think there's always challenges because people conflate like the company with the scientists and the science being done. So, you know, I think that prescription medications should be affordable and subsidized, but that conflicts with his beliefs about not providing affordable healthcare. So, you know, if you're talking about oversight in the context of, you know, price gouging, that's not to do with the science, that's to do with the healthcare infrastructure and the capitalistic insurance infrastructure that we have in this country. There's quite a few safety checkpoints for regulated pharmaceuticals. What I would like to see is more oversight for the big unregulated pharma, which is the supplement industry, because those are all pharmaceutical companies. So if he's saying that, then I'm all for that. Yeah. And that would involve repealing the 1994 Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act.
Yeah, no, I'm on board with you. I will say I think some things in pharma need to be more regulated, but that's different. And I don't think it's in a way that people understand. I think the bias in the pharma industry, it's not like one, except the Sacklers in general, it's not like one evil person that's just like, hey, I do not care about human life, I want this to go this way. It's more about like systemic violence, and I don't want to explain the term, but essentially it's just the way the rules are structured is to incentivize profit, which is problematic. But it's not like scientists lying about the results.
Right. And you find
go ahead.
Scientific fraud more often in non-regulated environments than in regulatory science. So
yeah, and people tend to misconstrue. There's data showing that like if a paper is sponsored by industry, it's way more likely to show a result, but people don't understand that the industry's not going to fund the paper if it's unlikely to be structured in a way that's going to show results. So yes, there is some bias, but it's not like very evil and again just people lying. That I think that's probably rare and minor, although there are very, very salient cases that should be dealt very aggressively. Look, so I'm for the capital punishment for companies. I think if a company does something evil like the Sacklers, it's like, yeah, that's done. Your company just doesn't exist anymore. Like the government steals it or something. I don't know the ramification. I'm not a politician. It's just I think something should happen for cases like this.
Yeah, and I think, you know, often when you talk about, you know, people vilifying big pharma, again, they're conflating a singular person or a single incident, right? You know, and they ignore or exclude the hundreds and thousands of other things that have demonstrably improved people's health and lives. And so you can always cherry pick an example to try to push that position, but that's why you have to look at the body of evidence, right? And often you find, you know, people are like, oh, well, thalidomide, like that was really bad. Well, you know what? That wasn't approved in the US because of our regulatory oversight. So, you know, a lot of people who use examples to try to prove a point, they don't actually know what they're talking about.
Yeah. No, I agree. But again, I'm not saying we don't need more oversight. It's just the degree and the nature. I guess it brings us to another point. So what's really interesting with RFK is that he's like, no, there's no evidence that the vaccines are safe or effective. And then he promotes something like raw milk, which has demonstrable evidence of being harmful and no real credible evidence of being effective at anything compared to pasteurized milk. So it's a very interesting selective bias. It's just, because it's natural, it's okay. For some reason, vaccines need to be proven like 40 times in millions of people. That's not enough, but like ample data that raw milk, I did a post on this, it's 838 times more risky than regular unpasteurized dairy.
Yeah.
But for some reason, and there's no nutritional benefit at all. Macros are the same. Micros are the same. The only difference was like a 0.50% difference in like, I think it's like DHP or DHT or something. I don't remember the exact molecule, but it's something I've never heard of. The people that advocate for raw milk probably have never heard of. And it's 0.5% is not, it's probably not a good source of that if you need that, you know? So yeah, why do you think that there's this like disparity and skepticism there?
Well, I mean, it's the raw milk movement has really been promoted by the biohacking bros and the wellness influencers, right? And it's almost as like a point of pride of like rebelling against factual information. And you know, we actually saw a surge when avian influenza was detected in dairy cattle. There was a 25% increase in raw milk purchases this year during the same period compared to last year after the H5N1 avian influenza cases were announced. You know, it really is, you know, it's a confluence of this take control of your health, the appeal to nature fallacy, the erosion of trust in actual science, and this, you know, demonization. So there's actually this direct link between wellness behaviors, things like supplements and buying organic and you know, taking herbal remedies, and medical conspiracism. And a lot of that medical conspiracism, the beliefs are really centered around the government lying, the government trying to control you, the government doing this. And so there's cancer conspiracies, there's vaccine conspiracies, there's conspiracies about genetically engineered crops. And so it really plays into that, where if you can, you know, suggest that pasteurization, which is one of the most impactful public health measures ever developed, is some sort of government conspiracy, then you can convince people that the, you know, unpasteurized version, the raw milk version, is superior. And so raw milk is considered one of the riskiest foods to consume. And a lot of people are like, well, there's actually not that many cases of foodborne illness, and it's because we pasteurize milk now. But
Yes.
when you actually look at the data, when you're looking at recent outbreaks of foodborne illness, we're talking about things like Campylobacter infections, E. coli infections, Listeria infections, Brucella infections. The prevalence of these associated with raw milk, 78% of the single state raw milk outbreaks are in states where they've relaxed their prohibitions on selling unpasteurized milk. So these are states where they've loosened the laws and they allow the sale of it. And the majority of the hospitalizations and illnesses are amongst kids for two reasons. Kids are, you know, drinkers of milk, greater drinkers of milk compared to adults. And they have a less mature immune system. So a lot of these infections are going to impact kids more. So there's no data to support the consumption of raw milk. It's not nutritionally beneficial. You're not impacting the proteins in a point where it's going to actually affect how you process and extract nutrients from milk proteins. It's not reducing the incidence of lactose intolerance, because pasteurization doesn't impact the lactose sugar. It doesn't boost your immunity. It doesn't confer antibodies or anything that, you know, people claim it does. It only puts you and your family at risk.
Yeah, I agree. So on the screen I pulled up, you know, as if raw milk consumption doubles, hospitalization will also double. I don't know if it's a linear increase, but I assume so. I don't know why it wouldn't be. So,
well, it actually
kind of problematic if you want to be health, you know.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly not aligned with goals of improving health, and it could even be exponential, because if you see the number of farms processing and selling raw milk, that also means that the overall food safety standards may decline, and so you may actually see an exponential trend. It's hard to project, you know, now, but yeah, it's a very bizarre trend recently.
Yeah.
So.
And sometimes I feel like I'm taking crazy pill, because this is the party that's always ranting about kids and protecting your kids.
Yeah, I mean,
and it's the party that's gutting, you know, everything, every project for kids. Yeah.
Their actions are in direct opposition to advocating for children's health, in every metric possible. So.
Almost, yeah. You know, raw milk, like removing raw milk and promoting vaccines is probably the things that made infant mortality drop by so much. And then also talk about, sexual assaults and all these cabals of sexual assault. And it's like, you just elected like a good friend of P. Diddy and Epstein's best friend. There's like countless hours of footage of him saying like, yeah, he's a great guy, he likes young girls. And it's like, am I crazy? Like, I don't know. It's like, this isn't the devil. This is like the devil's cousin. Like, I'm not saying Donald Trump is the devil, but it's just like, there's a level of disconnect between, he keeps doing awful things and we think he's going to prevent people from doing these awful things. That's kind of contradictory to me.
Yeah.
But yeah, whatever. I'm not a politician. So one thing I talked about the devil's advocate. This is where it comes in. So this one I couldn't explain outright. So with raw milk, I don't know if you're familiar with that theory that it boosts the immune system. Granted, I don't think I want to caveat this. I don't think that it is worth the risk because kids will die, right? I don't think it's, you might have fewer allergy or asthma. If your kid dies, who gives a shit, right? But there is, I can't deny that there is some data. I don't know if it's credible, so I'll just pull it up. So this is a review by...
I know which one it is.
Sozanska.
Yeah,
Raw cow's milk and its protective effect on allergies and asthma, paper from 2019. So essentially they showed people that live on farm or had rural contact. It was only done in rural population, essentially, and it's people that drink raw milk. So my argument at first was just like, they compare people that live in cities that are polluted, so that's why they have more allergies and more asthma. But it wasn't. It was people that lived on farms or in rural areas, and they checked if they drank raw milk, that they'd have fewer allergies or asthma. And overall, they did. So it was a 32% drop in asthma rates and somewhat similar in allergies. Can you explain why we observe these results? And again, we're not advocated doing that. It's risky.
Yes. Yeah, and also this is a great example of relative rate versus absolute rate. So a lot of times you're going to see people inflating data by saying, there was a 30% reduction. But if the rate of milk allergy or something is about 1% of the population, a 30% reduction means you're going from 1% to 0.07%, or if it's an increase, you're going from 1% to 1.3%. So these absolute rates are not actually really clinically relevant. So these observations, because there's been a few meta-analyses on this as well, this is related to this umbrella term that they call the farm effect, where they say that kids that grew up on farms have reduced prevalence of allergies. Now, the data that exists, there are very weak data. They're very small study groups. It's observation only, so there's no causal relationship, and the association, as I mentioned, is weak. And it's also not unique to consuming raw milk. It's an incredibly complex, multifactorial story. Now, there's some theoretical mechanisms that relate to kind of microorganism exposure early in life versus development of allergic conditions. But this typically relates to parasitic infections and allergies because the arm of the immune system that defends against parasitic infections is the same arm that also develops allergies, which is essentially an inappropriate response to a benign molecule. And so it's kind of like an arm of the hygiene hypothesis, where if as a child, while your immune system is getting educated and learning what to react to and what not to react to, it's able to kind of moderate the potential likelihood of responding inappropriately to an allergen in the future. And so, but again, like, this is not the whole story. While there might be a relationship between early immune system education, it is not unique to consuming raw milk. It's really related to many different environmental factors, genetics, environment, etc. And there's not a single factor that's going to determine whether someone develops allergies or asthma. And there's no causal relationship between consuming raw milk and reduced prevalence of allergies or asthma. especially because the data are very, very limited and don't actually show a direct relationship between them. I see that you're looking at some of the MAHA study. So this is
it's the brick study.
So I saw the
Tabia brick. So can I explain the study a little bit? Because I think I found the answer just talking to you explaining it. So this is where the 32% difference was the beneficial effects of farm milk consumption on asthma, allergies, and infections, from meta-analysis to evidence of clinical trial. Tabia Brick, she has a master's in public health, and I can't find the date. But essentially, yeah, they saw a 32% difference. And what's interesting with this paper, again, is that they normalized, so they didn't compare it to the population in cities. So and the effect was the same whether you lived on the farm or if you just lived in the rural area. So it wasn't affected by, so the farm effect, I could say there's a limitation to that. What I found is that they compared to people who either drank pasteurized milk or no milk. So it could just be that people that drink raw milk drink more milk. So they're more exposed to the hygiene effects that you mentioned. You know what I mean? Like the hygiene hypothesis is more at play because you're more likely to have allergies if you don't drink milk at all, but it doesn't mean it has to be pasteurized. Does that make sense, or is there anything I'm missing?
I mean, I don't think that there's a lot of data to say that you're more likely to have allergies whether or not you drink milk either.
Okay.
There's a lot of complexity with the regard to development of allergies. And of course, when you're talking about allergies, you have to talk about whether these are food allergies, to what antigens, are they environmental allergies, are they respiratory allergies? It's really, really complex. But essentially, there's not causal data that milk in and of itself is related to developing allergies, and raw milk isn't protective compared to pasteurized milk. If you actually look at the raw data of here, which I think you said they're not listed, you're going to find that the actual raw data don't really support that. And that's a lot of times why they transpose data to kind of make things look more impactful than they actually are. You know, and I know that they use a lot of jargon to theorize mechanisms of, you know, somatic cell count and shedding and all these sorts of things. But there's just not a lot of plausibility, because when you're talking about the difference in number of like potential probiotics that might be found in raw milk versus pasteurized milk, it's a drop in the bucket compared to what you're exposed to just by living. Like going into your bathroom and having a pet and living in a home, you have trillions of microorganisms in and on you at all times. So unless you were living in like a hermetically sealed compartment and that was your only exposure to microorganisms, it's really not likely that it's going to have any sort of clinical benefit. However, many of the microorganisms that are not killed through pasteurization are pathogenic, and that has a clinical harm.
Yeah. So I feel like maybe there's a very small effect, but it's not clinically relevant because we're talking about relative difference, not absolute difference. Yeah, I feel like that's the most condemning. And again, if we compare it to the risk, like being 838 times more risky, and the fact that asthma, especially for children, and allergies are relatively rare, or at least life-threatening ones, I don't think that's something. It's not a good risk ratio benefit, especially if you're anti-vaccine. If you're anti-vaccine, you should also be anti-raw milk.
Yeah,
it kind of doesn't make sense that that's inverted, because raw milk, if you think about raw milk as a way to reduce allergies and asthma, it's incredibly ineffective and incredibly unsafe compared to vaccines. So yeah, it's a huge double standard. Yeah, okay, so good. That's the one that was kind of freaking me out. And yeah, I guess it brings me to my next one. I think this is the pivotal question. It's just like a lot of people, and again, I had this conversation with a guy. So he said, essentially, he was talking about oysters. We consume oysters raw, and there's vibriosis, which has can kill people. And he completely fumbled the numbers. So essentially, I calculated it. So essentially, there's 80,000 cases of vibriosis per year, and only 100 die from it. So this is about, if we calculate all the numbers, essentially, if you compare raw milk to raw oysters, relative to consumption, raw oysters are something like 2,400 times less risky than raw milk. Because more people consume oysters, more people consume leafy greens, these other things that are like, well, this is risky as well. So yeah, I feel like there's a level difference. Yeah.
Absolutely. Like, it's all like, people aren't good at putting risk into context, and a lot of these conversations that you hear, like RFK Jr. and a lot of these MAHA people, they're really exploiting that risk perception gap, right? They're creating all this unnecessary fear and worry about things that actually pose very little risk to us, like vaccine ingredients and food dyes and food ingredients and things like that, and they're ignoring the actual things that have these major impacts on health, like vaccines and access to nutritious food for everyone, regardless of wealth, and access to healthcare, and the impacts of climate change, and so on and so forth. And yeah, I mean, everything is a risk, but again, walking across the street is a greater risk, than the adverse effect associated with a vaccine. And when we talk about a lot of these foods, even especially for like raw fishes, raw sea shellfish, and so on, there are food standards that are involved. But raw milk is not regulated by federal safety agencies, and so raw milk doesn't fall under that umbrella. And so, if you really want to sell raw milk, then you have to have regulatory oversight over the criteria for that, and that's something that the party of limited government that's going to gut the food safety agencies doesn't really want to do. So you can't really have it both ways. Now, when you talk about Vibrio vulnificus infections as a result of raw oysters, we're going to likely see those increase as the oceans warm and those bacteria are able to survive in more expanded oceans where we harvest oysters. Both, mostly oysters are planted by oyster farmers. I went to an oyster farm, an oyster hatchery, and it was fascinating. Yeah, I mean, Vibrio typically lives in warmer water, but as water is warm, now you have more co-occurrence with oysters. And so that's something that we need to address if we want to address foodborne illness, if people really want to move the goalposts and talk about oysters.
Yeah. So just to give people perspective, again, when people compare these numbers, they're not thinking about how rare milk consumption is. If you look at the CDC numbers, I believe it's something like under 4% of the population consumes raw dairy if we combine cheese and milk. I think for milk, it's 1.6%. For oysters, it's 7%. According to Statistica, I don't know if it's the best source, but whatever. Raw clams is 7%, raw oysters 17%, raw sprouts 26%, sushi with raw fish 32%. And also, yeah, I mean, you could cook the oysters, but there's a lot of things where they suggest they'll talk about alcohol or cigarettes. It's like you can't pasteurize cigarettes or alcohol, first of all, and get the same inebriating effect. I personally think cigarettes should be banned. I've never smoked. I think smoking is dumb. It probably will never happen in the States, but that's what they did in New Zealand. I think from a certain point, if you're 18, everyone that's like that wasn't 18 when they passed the law. They just can't buy cigarettes ever. I don't know if it's going to work because there is a lot of, debate as to whether prohibition works. It hasn't worked for alcohol. Will it work for cigarettes? I think cigarettes, it's pretty easy to say, like, you smoke, that's kind of lame. But alcohol, I think, it's just fun. Cigarettes, it's like you're stressed. That's, just don't be stressed. That's not cool. Alcohol is a social inhibitor. I feel like the effects are too socially advantageous and common to ban. But that's, that's not my... I don't want to venture because I'm not an expert on that domain. I don't know what you think.
Yeah, I mean, both of those substances have far greater risk than a lot of things that these people like to demonize. And, they have causal relationships with cancers, whereas things they demonize do not have causal relationships with cancer. I think they like to talk about like things like sugar addiction, and while there isn't causal evidence of a true physical dependency of sugar, there are these are chemicals, these are drugs that can be addictive for people. So it's a challenge of kind of that risk mitigation. So I agree. Prohibition, we don't have a great history, or mandates or anything, right? Which is kind of what we're talking about. But yeah, I mean, people, again, aren't great at assessing risk, and they'll, happily indulge in tobacco or nicotine products or alcohol while simultaneously saying that conventionally grown produce is toxic.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. It's a complex question. It's just like, how is the population going to react? What is the good? How much do we treat people like an adult? I just think there's some cases that people act like freedom is inherently good. It's just like the freedom to kill a baby.
Right.
That's a bad example, but like the freedom to like kill a human being, a living human being, is it's bad in itself.
Yeah,
But
I mean,
so
it's,
like stuff like not wearing a seatbelt. That's like, I'm fine. I don't give a shit about your freedom to not wear a seatbelt. You're a dumbass if you think. Also, like, if one of the reasons that we could get it passed is because a lot of people would go through the window and murder the people in the other car.
right, and
So
and you know,
you're
so
just putting everyone in danger.
So, you know, it's interesting because we have a lot of these public health measures that are designed to protect you, but also your community, because again, there's this like sentiment that, well, I should be able to do whatever I want without regard for the impact on other people. And even if you're talking about something like smoking, we know secondhand smoking is also directly linked to many cancers, particularly long-term secondhand smoke exposure. And so it's always really interesting to me that people feel like they don't need to exist in a society to consider the impact of their behavior on other people, yet they want to reap all the benefits of living in a society. And and that seems to be like what the ideal is of like this American patriot, like this rugged individualism where there's just no regard for anyone else. And it's really kind of saddening to be fair.
And I find it really interesting as well how these people that are against these things that curb freedom, they're against abortion. I mean, there's a debate. You could say some people think a fetus is a living human being. I don't want to get into that. Fine, there's an argument there. But the one I really don't agree with, because they're always saying it's your right as an adult to choose, they're against euthanasia. Which I don't know if you've worked in a hospital. I have. I've seen people die in hospitals and like in their own shit. And they just want to die. I've seen my own grandpa die, like losing his mind. He was a doctor, so I think he fucking knew what it was to die in hospital. I remember him saying, like, you know, the last thing I want is to die in like the hospital I worked in, and that's exactly what happened because euthanasia was not legal at the time. And you know, it's fucking awful. He lost his mind progressively. Like, he had a rare genetic disease called like ataxia labos, and like on my grandma and his like wedding anniversary, he was completely losing mind. He just wanted to kill himself. That's all we knew. So he tried to kill himself twice by ramming his head between the bars until he had asphyxiation, and it didn't work. Tried to do that twice, and then again on the wedding anniversary, he was kind of gone by that point. He choked my grandma, and it's just like, what's the fucking point? Like, he was an adult. He wanted to die. He said that for years. He's a doctor. He's more qualified than anyone. He worked in that specific hospital to know what he wants to do with his life, and you're just taking that right away. It's like the ultimate freedom to just do what you want with your life, and that doesn't affect anyone. It's literally your life, and they're like, no, that's awful, that's not good. But then they, you know, if you want to say, hey, maybe you should like do something that's going to help people, like encouraging vaccine, no, that's communism. I find that super interesting.
Yeah
Sorry, it's kind of got emotional.
I think about those cognitive dissonance examples a lot, because, you know, when we're talking about increased life expectancy, you also talk about quality of life, right? And so, you know, this is a conversation that everyone with a terminal disease has to kind of come to grips with in terms of what's the quality of extending versus not. And yeah, there is a lot of hypocrisy in a lot of these, you know, things that they want to say it's about freedom or decisions. And really it's about controlling what other people are allowed to do under this false premise of, you know, caring about health or freedom or whatever.
Yeah, it's a conundrum. Yeah, we've been going for almost 2 hours. So what we're going to do, if you have time, is we're just going to talk about glyphosate. And then we're going to do a rapid round of questions. Just follow the questions and people that follow you that ask me. So just glyphosate, am I saying that right?
Yeah, glyphosate.
Yeah. So Roundup, it's a herbicide, right?
Yes.
Am I making
it? Is an herbicide.
So it's used to protect corn a lot and like crops. The only paper that I found that had credible evidence, and that's the one that's usually used in cases, is the DeRouche 2005 paper. I'll share my screen. So essentially, It shows overall, if you look at any cancer, there's no effect. If you look at cancer overall, there's no effect. The only exception, so the paper is called Cancer Incidence Amount Glyphosate Exposed Pesticide Applicators in the Agricultural Health Industry by Anne-Claire J. Derousse, 2004.
Yeah, so this is the largest longitudinal study of pesticide applicators or herbicide applicators, over 57,000 people, and followed them for several years to assess potential association with occupational higher exposure amongst farm workers.
Yeah, so there's an a fortiori argument to be made here. Like, if someone whose job is to apply large swaths of it and they're fine, you eating it is probably fine as well, because presumably they also eat corn. But yeah, the only exception is they found an 80% rise in melanoma. My reasoning was just they're in the sun all day.
Outside.
That's the main cause of melanoma.
Yep,
right.
That's exactly right. Yeah. So so this is, it's really ironic. So glyphosate, there's kind of a very seedy history behind this. So often when you talk about glyphosate, it gets conflated with genetic engineering and Roundup and cancer. And it's because of all these tort lawsuits that I mentioned that really started with RFK Jr. Because he wanted to make a lot of money by suing these agriculture and pesticide companies. And so, you know, they're kind of confused and lumped into these buckets where you mention it and you can't even have a productive discussion because you're like, Roundup causes cancer, it's toxic, and how dare you defend it? And it's people that, you know, have literally heard this for 20 years, and it's really hard to, like, you know, erase this conspiracy. So glyphosate is a broad spectrum herbicide, and it's used to kill weeds. So an herbicide kills plants. And this one is broad spectrum, meaning it targets all plants indiscriminately. And the reason it does it is because it interferes with an enzyme in a pathway called the shikimate pathway that plants need to produce specific amino acids. So plants are organisms, but they photosynthesize, right? So they produce their own proteins, whereas humans, we consume proteins for the most part. And so they need to be able to make their own amino acids. And if they can't do that, then they wilt, they don't have structural proteins, and they fall over and they die, right? So scientists figured out that this chemical, glyphosate, actually inhibits the ability of these plants to make certain amino acids. And so in the presence of glyphosate, they wither and they die. They developed certain plant species that weren't impacted by that action. And what they did was they replaced the plant enzyme with the bacterial version, and that bacterial version of the enzyme isn't affected by glyphosate. So you could expose the crop plant to it and the weeds would die, but the crop plant would grow. It's actually pretty ingenious. And so what that enabled farmers to do is to prevent weeds from overtaking seedlings at either pre-planting or at early emergence when the plants are not strong enough to overcome weeds. And you didn't have to use multiple herbicides or additional ways to control weeds like tilling, which causes soil erosion and leaching of nutrients and can reduce the yield of your crops. You could just use this one chemical. And so it was revolutionary, and it's been in use for over 30 years. There are over 5,000 studies. There are over 20 global safety agencies that have all concluded that there's no link to cancer. But the only agency that says probably linked to cancer is this group, the International Agency for Cancer Research, the IARC. And people confuse this and they say that it's the World Health Organization, it's the WHO, but it's not. It's a working group within the WHO, and the IARC classified glyphosate as probably carcinogenic, which has a very specific meaning in their criteria. But the big thing is that all they do is hazard assessment, meaning they're asking the question, is there a theoretical world in which this substance at some exposure and dosage could hypothetically cause cancer? And of the over 200 substances or exposures they've looked at, including night shift work and working in a barber shop, pretty much all of them have been ranked as some hypothetical, yes, because they don't actually do a risk assessment, meaning what's the actual likelihood that someone with a realistic exposure could have an increased risk of cancer. So all of the other agencies that do this, including other groups of the WHO, like the JECFA, which is the Joint Expert Committee on Food Additives, they've assessed it. They've all said that there's no evidence, mechanistic, population level, toxicological, that glyphosate is linked to cancer in any capacity. And that's also supported by the longitudinal study that you just showed. But everybody ignores the dozens upon dozens of actual risk assessments done by global safety agencies. And they just look at that IARC hazard assessment, which ironically, probably carcinogenic, doesn't actually mean that it does cause cancer in people. And the particular one for glyphosate, there's actually leaked documents that show that they removed that epidemiological study that you just showed so that they could skew the data they were using to suggest that there was some plausibility. It's worth noting that people on the IARC at that time had financial interests with organic farms that like to demonize genetic engineering and GE crops. So there's a lot of conflict of interest there. But glyphosate itself, yeah, it doesn't cause cancer. It's not linked to cancer. On top of it basically allowing farmers to produce foods without having used multiple herbicides, it also allowed them to stop using herbicides with far more risk associated with them. So if we're talking about human health, don't we also want to talk about farmers' health? And so glyphosate was allowed farmers to stop the use of things like fluazafop, cyanazine, allichlor, and metallochlor, which have far more toxicological risk. And everyone talks about how use of glyphosate has increased, but they never include the fact that the use of all of these other herbicides has plummeted because we can use a safer herbicide to control these weeds. On top of that, people are always saying, oh, well, your foods are covered in glyphosate and they're riddled with pesticides. It's a weed killer, right? So are there weeds growing on your fruits and vegetables? No. Weeds are growing out of the ground when you're planting seeds or when your seedlings are very small. So when would you might treat a field with a weed killer? Well, before you plant it or right after seedlings have emerged. There's no finished foods being treated with glyphosate because you don't need to kill weeds on a finished food. Yeah. And on top of that, most food items that you're buying at the store, you're not treating with glyphosate whatsoever because they are also plants. They can't tolerate it unless they're a tolerant version. And there's only 6 crops in the US that have glyphosate tolerant versions. And the primary crops that it's used on is corn and alfalfa and soybean. And the corn is used primarily to make corn syrups and sugars. There's sugar beets, which is also used to make sugar. Alfalfa is used to make animal feed. So like, these are not like your green peppers at the store, your tomatoes at the store. Like, there's just so much misinformation, and it is this confluence of this anti-conventional farming, fear of pesticides, when in reality, if you look at the herbicides that are used in organic farming, because organic farming uses pesticides, you're looking at things like clove oil. The active ingredient is eugenol, or vinegar. In this case, it's 20% industrial acetic acid. And those are more toxic than glyphosate, at least by twofold. And so but there's a lot of anti-science activist groups like Moms Across America, RFK Jr.'s Children's Health Defense, and they've made a ton of money by scaring people about glyphosate, when in reality, the studies that look at like people excreting glyphosate in urine, there's no difference between the urine levels of people who ate organic food versus conventional food. And the levels we're talking about are parts per trillion. And a part per trillion in time representation is 1 second in 31,700 years. So these levels are minuscule. There's no theoretical, plausible, there's no data to suggest that any of this poses any harm. But what it does is it scares people from modern agriculture that could actually improve our ecosystems and farmers and our food supply, and scares people from conventional produce, which is half the price and equally nutritious and plenty safe. And any pesticide use, glyphosate or otherwise, is regulated for residual traces that might be found on finished produce items. And these foods are surveilled and monitored. And ironically, the people that fearmonger about them are using the government surveillance data to scare people by inflating data.
Yeah, I agree. So essentially, they're just using the test to rule out as a way to rule in, which doesn't really make sense. It's like saying, because you're not Nazi, you're a fourth-wave feminist. It doesn't make sense. Yeah, I guess before the rapid fire, I can really quickly go over fluoride. So because that's the big talking point. Just really quickly, the only high-quality study on fluoride that shows an effect is, according to the Preeti 2019, I think, systematic review, is this green 2019 paper called Association Between Maternal Fluoride Exposure During Pregnancy and IQ Scores in Offsprings in Canada. Essentially, they show like almost like non-significant. So if you look at the effect, it's only in boys, and it's like 0.8 point away from 0.60 points away from zero. So almost non-significant difference in IQ for children. In adults, I think it's pretty subtle. That has no effect on IQ. And then even in kids, because this is a shit study technically, and for when pregnant women took them, it was 3.66. I talked to Langer Nutrition today, Abby Langer, about this, and she said another limitation besides the one that I pointed out, that they didn't adjust for race, ethnicity, income, stuff that's going to affect IQ.
Yep.
Yeah. A lot of these were people that went over the fluoride level. So I feel like the concern, which isn't even the messaging being done, should be like, we should make sure that counties account for the amount of fluoride rather than changing the limit, because the limit seems to be fine. Do you have anything to add to this?
Yeah, no, I mean, you're absolutely right. Fluoride is added to water in the US at 0.7 parts per million, so that's 0.7 milligrams per liter of water. If you want an analogy, that's about between 7 to 12 grains of salt per liter of water. So that's how small a level we're talking about. A lot of the studies where they're looking at neurological or IQ outcomes, these are observational only, and you're looking at places where natural fluoride levels are orders of magnitude higher, and they don't address confounding variables, right? One of them that's been frequently cited and cherry-picked, they had concurrent high levels of environmental arsenic and asbestos. There was pollution.
But that's good for you though, right?
Yeah.
Because it's natural.
Yeah.
It's natural.
And fluoride's
it's not
natural.
like glyphosate.
Fluoride's natural too. But that's the bad natural. But yeah, so I mean, there's no causal relationship between IQ levels and fluoride exposure. Certainly the fluoride exposure that you would actually be exposed to. When you look at things like adverse skeletal effects, you would need to ingest beyond 4 milligrams per kilogram of body weight of fluoride to have skeletal adverse effects. And that's already a pretty conservative level, because when we look at no adverse effect levels, usually we're looking at least 100-fold lower than what was ever observed. And that means that if we're talking about 0.7 parts per million in water, a kid weighing 22 pounds would have to drink 57 liters of that water. And they would experience water toxicity after about 4 liters. 3.25 cups of that water. So yeah, I mean, fluoride, not a concern in water. It does prevent dental disease and dental caries. It does improve the strength of dental enamel. It does allow our teeth to withstand a more acidic environment before they demineralize. And we've seen places that have removed fluoride from water have increased rates of dental caries up to 50% after removing fluoride from water. So we also see a lot of people saying, oh, well, Europe doesn't fluoridate their water. And they conveniently leave out the fact that most of Europe, if they don't have fluoridated water, they fluoridate their salt. So they're still supplying systemic fluoride. It's just in their table salt instead of in their water supply.
Yeah, and there's the example of Italy where the water is naturally very fluoridated.
Exactly. Because fluoride is a substance that is found in both minerals and through various biological reactions in our environment. So it is everywhere.
Yeah. And one thing I'd say that's the last nail in the coffin for me. This is a recurring theme for this episode. So only 1 out of 5 studies graded as excellent, and this is the one we talked about, the green study. Graded as excellent quality showed a negative association between fluoride exposure and cognitive outcomes, whereas 30 of 34 poor and fair quality studies reported negative associations. So what that tells me is that, it only shows an effect when it's a shit quality study, essentially. And the one good quality study didn't account for anything.
Right, and these are because these studies are fishing expeditions that are usually spurred by people who have biases, they have chemophobia, they've been led to believe that these things are bad, and we see a lot of that with these exposure, these observational kind of epidemiological studies where they're literally kind of looking for a needle in a haystack to kind of create a problem where there isn't one, and those tend to be very poor quality studies.
Yeah. Oh my God, we've done it. We went over. We're not going to talk about Huberman because it's way too much.
Maybe
another
we'll do
day. Another episode. But
we'll do all the cancer. We'll do the estrogen, the endocrine stuff for another day.
Yeah, let's just do rapid fire questions. So answer in 1 or 2 cents.
Okay.
Except one, my favorite question, which is I call the Harry Potter question. I guess we're gonna have to skip this one. First one, how do you manage social media toxicity? So this is my friend Hiro Pereira. And then the other is from Ryan Frecka. It goes together. What advice would you offer to other health professionals who get exhausted by misinformation?
Yeah, it's really hard to manage it. So one of the things that I do is I set aside like windows of time where I will log in or log out, and I turn off all my notifications. So I don't see like the deluge of comments or tags or trolls or things like that. And so people, if they really wanted to get a hold of me and ask me a question, there are many ways to actually credibly find me. And usually those people are just engagement farming or trying to sea lion, which is a really great way to exhaust people that are trying to do good work. It's this pretending to ask good faith questions where they're just trying to create these circular arguments and they don't ever actually want to learn anything. So I just don't engage with that. If someone has a legitimate question and they actually seem inclined to learn, I will try to find time for that. But yeah, you have to preserve your own mental health. And I like to remind myself that these people are keyboard warriors, and they're going to target anybody that is trying to counteract things that they have vested interest in, whether financial or personal beliefs. And, it's really helpful to just, easier said than done, but, trying not to take it personally. Of course, when you get a lot of death threats, that can be really hard, but, find the time to disconnect and don't live online, especially because we are not making money. Like, this is not our job, right?
Okay. Rapid fire, remember? I'm just joking. This is a great answer. How bad is our PUFAs, PFAs, so microplastics, essentially? We can skip it.
Yeah,
it's a big question.
No, I mean, there's thousands of different chemicals that fit into the PFAS category. Most of them pose very little risk. The ones that do have regulatory oversight at this point, we've set guidelines for them, and how much risk do they actually pose? A lot of that's still being studied, but try not to take headlines with too much weight because a lot of them are sensationalized.
Yeah. There's another question about food coloring. I'll just go over it quickly. Do you have an article written about this, if I remember correctly? So I'll just refer them to this, but we just give you an example. The big one that's been banned was caramel food coloring. I did the calculation, and you confirm my numbers are all right. It was something like 327,000 Diet Cokes is what you would need to consume in a day. That's what they fed the rat, essentially, to increase the cancer by about 10%. I'll do a post on it, but essentially, if you're not drinking 327 Cokes a day, you're fine, because the dosage of under it, which is like 200,000 Cokes a day, didn't show a problem. So it's a good example of what you call like a red herring. It's just, they're distracting. It's low cost solutions for a company that look like politically you're doing something, but it's actually, they're not doing the actual stuff that might help for health. A
lot of times these companies are forced into these things because of public outcry that's not based on credible facts. And a lot of times people claim that these things are banned in other countries when they're actually not, and they don't understand that different countries use different nomenclature. So red 40, not banned, blue 1, blue 2, like these things are not banned in other countries. And even caramel coloring, or, the compound you're referring to, which is 4-MEI, is also not banned in the European Union. But yeah, I mean, the amount of these things that you actually would have to consume to have any sort of theoretical risk is orders of magnitude higher than what you could ever theoretically ingest. And we need to be focusing on making healthcare and food more affordable and accessible to everyone, not these performative things about food dyes, which are usually based on false information to begin with.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like saying there's no peppers in Mexico because they call them chiles. It's kind of dumb. What's another one? How do we defeat the MAHA movement? I don't remember who asked that.
Oh my gosh.
Broad strokes. Actually, you know what? Do you want me to? I have a better question.
Okay. Yeah.
No. Yeah. How do we fight it? Yeah. No. Go ahead.
Okay. I mean, we need to reclaim critical thinking. People need to stop thinking that having subject matter expertise or skilled expertise when it comes to science is something that we need to reject, because you don't reject that in any other field, right? You don't go to a accountant to fix your car. You go to someone that's trained in that field, right? And so we need to reclaim that, but we need the media outlets to stop contributing, because every day there's a new clickbait headline that allows this movement to erode science by mischaracterizing a petri dish study or giving a platform to someone who's writing an opinion and presenting it as fact. So there needs to be infrastructure. We can't, scientists can't do it on our own, and media outlets can't say there's a misinformation crisis and then contribute to it. So until society actually wants to do something about it, I don't know that there's a lot we can do. But it starts with education and critical thinking.
Yeah, I have two potential solutions. I think the easiest is to, a home ec. You make that a critical thinking class with just basics of science, to teach them about the hierarchy of evidence and stuff like that. And then the second would be perhaps for scientific journalism, you have a professional board where, if you share too much misinformation, you get your license revoked. Some people will say that's a form of communism. There's probably ways to do it where, it's similar to doctors. Doctors, if they share too much information, they lose their license as well. And there's ways people think if you say something that slightly diverts, it's going to be fine. It's more like if you kill people with misinformation, then you might lose your license. It's very fucking hard, to lose your license.
Well, and there needs to be better training for who's the right expert, who are the anti-science activist organizations, because there are reporters who frequently just propagate misinformation because they're going to their contacts who are not the appropriate people to be talking on these subjects.
Yeah. From Sab Helps You Move, why are mRNA vaccines safe?
Yeah, I mean, they're safe for the same reason other vaccines are safe, and actually I would say even a little bit more so. So basically what it is it's a fragment of, it's a code for a protein, and a protein that is, looking at it, the protein is something that is viewed as foreign by our body. We call it an antigen that triggers that immune response. So it's basically even more precursor to a subunit vaccine, where we're essentially training our immune system to recognize this viral protein, in this case of the COVID vaccines, and develop this memory immunity. We know they're safe because we have millions of data points demonstrating they're safe, and mRNA vaccines have been studied for over 30 years. The molecule itself has been studied for decades upon decades upon decades. And fun fact, every single organism produces mRNAs all the time, because that's what we use as our intermediate to make proteins in our body. So we don't need to be scared of a molecule simply because you don't have a fundamental knowledge of it. The scientists that are doing this work have the fundamental knowledge of it.
Yeah, I believe the research was already started back in the AIDS epidemic, if I recall. That's why it was so quick to find the vaccine for COVID, is just they essentially had the formula already. I might you misquoting, but something like that. The groundwork was laid, as you said.
Yeah, no, I mean, there have been trials for other mRNA vaccines, including for other coronaviruses like MERS. There was a rabies mRNA vaccine. There was also a flu mRNA vaccine trial. Now, the reasons those ones weren't approved is because we actually have existing rabies vaccines and existing flu vaccines that were more immunogenic. They stimulated a bigger immune response in those trials. And so you're not going to replace something that is not as robust, but there wasn't anything for COVID. And so, you know, they were able to develop these things using all of that other preliminary and previous clinical data.
Yeah, just, provide some support. Safety and efficacy of COVID-19 vaccines, a systematic review and meta-analysis of controlled and randomized controlled trial by Belladia from 2024 in January, so the most recent meta-analysis. All the approved vaccines were found to be safe and efficacious, but mRNA-based vaccines were found to be more efficacious against SARS-CoV-2 than other platforms. So yeah, we do have data. And again, I want to remind people these are probably the largest, possibly the largest and definitely the most scrutinized RCTs ever done.
Absolutely.
If someone had messed with the data, I think people would have noticed.
Yeah, for sure.
It would be something random like a dick pill that would have be swept under the rug. Yeah. Anyways, last question. And again, this is my favorite question, the Harry Potter question. If I gave you a magic wand, I put you in charge of the MAHA movement, you can do whatever you want. You have immunity, you can do whatever. What are you doing instead? Like to make America healthier?
How many things can I do?
It's your question. This is the last question. So, however long you have.
Magic wand.
Yeah.
Affordable and accessible healthcare for everyone with a focus on preventive healthcare and screening. Get rid of billionaires and narrow wealth inequality because that is a major predictor of health outcomes. Improve education with not a focus on standardized testing, but a focus on logic, critical thinking, and problem solving. Exercise-friendly cities and incentives for exercise programs, maybe coverage and insurance for exercise. And then, of course, improving access and addressing all the misinformation about fresh fruits and vegetables in the context of conventional farming and genetic tools, because people are not eating enough fruits and vegetables and fiber, and those are major determinants of health outcomes. It's not the food dyes and it's not the Fruit Loops. And there's a lot more, but I think those are probably the ones that are most, vaccines, obviously. But I feel like we talked about that a lot. These are the
supplements.
I mean, we need regulatory oversight of supplements, and that would remove probably 99% of them from the shelves. There are obviously a few single ingredient supplements like psyllium and folic acid for pregnancy and certain things that do have place medically. But yeah, we need to get rid of the 1994 DSHEA because that was terrible. And we need to refocus how we fund scientific research and how our government funding is distributed, because I don't think we need more trillions for weapons. I think we need to invest in safety and science and legitimate innovation that's going to improve our environment. That includes addressing climate crises, because climate change also impacts infectious diseases and food stability and access to food and a lot of other things that people don't realize.
Yeah, that's fantastic. But behind all of this, this will definitely be a two-parter because it was very long. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, no problem.
And we'll definitely have you again, but shorter time because I feel bad.
That's all right.
Where can people find you? And is there anything you want to plug that you're working on right now?
You can find me at dr.andrealove on social channels. I think, sometimes there's a missing dot, sometimes not. But my website is immunologic.org. You can find my newsletter there. It's also at news.immunologic.org. I try to write it when I have free time. I'm not working on any specific projects aside from my full-time job, but I do, find myself at conferences talking about science, talking about misinformation, and hopefully will do some more of that, as the need only grows, I think, at least in the immediate future.
And I could vouch for your blog. It's great, like immunologists. Whenever I have a question and I'm not sure, I just look, did Andrea do a post on this? And usually the answer is yes. And again, I'm always staggered that you have the time.
I have a very long topic list and not enough free hours to write. So, hopefully I'll, I aim to get at least one thing written a week, but I do like to provide a lot of like historical context because I want people to understand like why we do things the way we do. And that requires like understanding where we came from. And so I often put some like anthropological or, public health history in to frame things. And that takes a little bit of time to make it thorough.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right. So this was the Fact Check podcast. Thanks again to our guest. My name is Alexis Diego. I'm at Nobullshitphysio on all platforms. And peace out and leave us a 5-star review if you made it through the whole thing. Otherwise, you're weird. You're just a hater. Okay, bye. All right.